All right, hello again. This is video number 3. Now, environmental science is the subject, right? So before we really start getting into what effects humans have had on the environment, we're going to talk about what the environment was doing before humans got there. All right, so this is about ecosystems, and that's the different types of things that we have going on in nature. Of course, it's a science, so we try to learn as much as we can about nature if we're trying to study environmental science. What's going on there? And so basically, ecology is how these living things in the environment are going to react with the non-living things. How do they react with one another? And really, this is a way of looking at what was going on or would be going on, maybe without human intervention. So what is ecology? That's what ecology is. If the course is about connections, it's the connections between the living and non-living things in their environment. What's going on in nature? That's ecology. Okay, so what is going on in nature, right? So we have species, different things are going on. Human species, of course, and there are a wide variety of species that are going on. That's the biodiversity that we're talking about. So 1.75 million species. Well, so many of these species are so small that it's hard to detect them. And also, some of these species only live in a small area. So we don't have all the species figured out here, but we're starting to make quite a collection anyway of our knowledge of what's going on. Okay, so we've already talked about the idea of ecology. So if we're going to talk about these connections, we should see what's out there, what's going on. So a population is one species, a population of a certain species. Even in that species, there's going to be diversity, but in the community, we have a diversity of species. And the ecosystem is what they're reacting with, and then the biosphere is this whole thing. I'll try to break it down in a drawing for you here on how we build these things up. We start with the atoms of an element. That's the smallest part right there. And then we have the molecules that we talked about already. And then these are going to form cells, and now we have the chance for life to be forming once we have cells that are made up. And then we can get an organism, a living thing that we're talking about, all the plants and animals that we see. And the population, here you can see what that is. It's a population of some kind of gazelle or some kind of deer, it looks like, some kind of deer. Okay, and that's the population that lives in an area, so population is a big part of it. Community is the different populations together. Ecosystem is the whole thing with the living and the non-living. And then the biosphere is all the places that life happens around the Earth. So there's a lot going on in there, and that's only a part of our course, right? So once again, there is a lot to learn in this course, and the best thing to do is to take as many good notes as you can and just keep reviewing the information as often as you possibly can. And also looking for new information. Don't just limit yourself to what I give you. There's so much information out there about our class. Anyway, that pep talk is over. We'll go back to the lecture. All right, so, we might be thinking, well, insects, I could live without them. They're all part of a food chain, a food web. They're all connected, and we really need them. The butterflies here are as necessary as human beings, I guess, is what it comes down to. If you want everything to stay the way it is right now, there's a balance in nature, and the insects are important. They may seem pesky at some times, but they're a food source that goes up the food chain. They add to the biodiversity. So no mistaken parts right now, I guess, is what it comes down to. They're all interlocking. So what do we need to stay alive? What do we need, and what do these organisms need to stay alive? Because we're talking about sustainability here, right? Well, we need food, of course. We need air to breathe. And this is where we're going to find all of these things. So what do we need to keep ourselves alive? Just like all the other organisms. We need food, we need air, we need water, and those are the things that are going to keep us alive. Okay, so there are 4 areas that we're going to talk about this stuff here. The atmosphere is what we're breathing in. The troposphere is closest to us. The stratosphere is up a little bit higher, so we're concerned with what's going on there. Hydrosphere is the water, geosphere the earth, and the whole thing together is the biosphere. So biosphere is where all the life is going to be. So here we're talking about the earth itself, the geosphere, so what's going on underneath the planet, and then we're building ourselves up to the atmosphere, and you can see the hydrosphere is the water. So how are all these things connected? Okay, so here's a little bit of a better close-up view of it for you. We can separate this part into the lithosphere, the bottom of the atmosphere. I don't know if my arrow is showing up. And then the biosphere. And there you can see how all these things are connected. Okay, so biomes are going to be different. The life isn't put together the same way on all parts of the planet. The climate is going to have something to do with that. The amount of precipitation is going to be a big thing of it. And some of it is land and some of it is water. So biomes is taken in accounting of all these different areas where things are going to live, and we'll talk about those in detail. When we talk about the hydrosphere, the aquatic zones, freshwater, lakes and streams, and then marine, we're also talking about the ocean, the salt water. So there's freshwater and marine being salt water. And we'll talk about coral reefs and estuaries, so that would be a good thing to know, and the deep ocean itself. So estuaries, where the water and the sea meet each other, where the rivers and the sea meet each other, and that's a good important area. And then the deep ocean. Somebody asked a few years ago how deep was the ocean, so I found out this information. So much information available to us. So it goes down to about 7 miles, a lot going on in the deep ocean. Some of these critters can be found there. So go down deep enough, you're going to see some interesting things. Fascinating, really. Okay, so this is a little bit of talking about the different biomes that we're talking about. And like I said again, they have something to do with precipitation. And there you can see as we go from west to east on a little slice of the United States, the different kind of biomes that we would be in. We're more the deciduous forest area. Very good. There's some of that water that humans need so much. Okay, so here we go. Humans and other species, I should say. I enjoy some water. Okay, so here we go. You could tell that the area is going to change. We have deserts, we have mountains, we have grasslands, and we have an ocean on either side here. So there's a lot going on just in the United States. And if you've ever driven across the country, you know well and good that the landscape is going to change for you. Okay, so we'll talk more about all those kind of things here. Okay, so we've already talked about this. These are things that we need. We need the energy from the sun, no life. We need the nutrients into the soil so that sun can help grow plants. That's one of the great things the sun does for us. And as I mentioned before, we need gravity to bring water to us. And that alone is a good reason why we need gravity. Also gravity to hold in our atmosphere. Otherwise we would have nothing to breathe. So gravity, pretty important for us as well. So these three factors are going to be pretty big for sustaining life on our planet. Okay, so here's the energy that we're getting from the Earth. A lot of this is going to be absorbed by the Earth, so that heats up our planet too. We know that. Depending on how the seasons go here, we get a different amount of heat because of the tilt of the Earth. That's a good thing to know too. Some of this stuff here is the UV radiation, so we have to think about that. And a lot of it is absorbed by the ozone layer up in the stratosphere. So that's a good one too here for deflecting some of that stuff. We don't want too much of that coming our way. And then there are the gases here that will trap the heat and hold it in as well. So that's another good one for us there too, and that is the greenhouse effect that is talked about a lot. Okay, so here's a little bit of a closer view of it. And by the way, with the greenhouse effect, we do think of the greenhouse effect as being something that humans are affecting, and there's a lot of discussion about that right now, right? So just also good to point out that this greenhouse effect was important without people as well. We need the heat to be held in whether humans are affecting it or not. So even before we were maybe so industrialized, we were relying on the greenhouse effect. Now the question is whether we're making it too much of a good thing and holding in too much of the heat, in some cases. But that is widely discussed these days. By the way, that distinction is a good one to make. The naturally occurring and then the things that are caused by man or by people. And that would be, the name for that is anthropogenic. So if people are causing it, it's anthropogenic. Okay, so what do we need for these ecosystems? If we want to break these things down and understand them, we should know that. Some of the stuff is non-living, so that's the water that we need, the air that we breathe, all of this stuff is the abiotic or non-living, and then there's the biotic part, the living part. So here's a good idea of a lot of the connections that are going on in a very small area here, right? So a secondary consumer is something that eats the primary consumer. The grass is the producer. So here the grass is the producer. It gets its energy directly from the sun. The rabbit is the primary consumer. And if that bunny doesn't watch out, it's going to be food for the secondary consumer, the fox. And then the fox or the rabbit or any of these things, when they die, they're decomposed back into the soil. And with those nutrients that are being cycled through here, we have a chance to make the chain continue. The producer's giving off oxygen, taking in carbon dioxide, and also with this water that is going through the plant, adding to precipitation as well. And when the water goes through the plant and is released, that's called transpiration, and comes back as precipitation. So this is a good diagram of those connections. Okay, so you probably have friends who you think it's really cold out, but they don't even need a jacket. Some people seem to be able to handle the cold better. Some people seem to be able to handle the heat better. So we're probably familiar with this idea of range of tolerance. And it works out in nature as well. And you can say that for a particular population, maybe most of them would like to be here in the middle. That's the temperature that they prefer. This is what we're talking about, temperature. It could be related to a lot of things. And there are fewer of them out at the outside. And there's a place here where none of them can survive. So these are good things to know about as well. But this idea of your friend being able to handle the cold differently than you, that's some genetic diversity going on. And it's the same thing in other populations. And we've talked about biodiversity. Genetic diversity is a form of that. And very important also because, think about that. If there are some members of the species that can survive over here and the temperature shifts, then those members are going to keep the population going. Most of these might die off, but you'd still have your population going. And that diversity becomes helpful if things change later on. Okay, so let's see, producers and consumers. I mentioned producers are going to be the plants. They take their energy from the sun, they participate in photosynthesis, and then the consumers is everything that goes up from there. Besides the idea of the producers and the consumers, there are the detritivores and the decomposers. So the little bugs, we mentioned that the insects are important. They're going to break down the dead matter. And when they break them down a little bit further, the decomposers are able to help to turn them back into the nutrients that the soil will need. So there's no waste in nature. If you've ever seen a log fall over in nature and then watched it over in time, you're going to see that it gets eaten away. And that's not a bad thing. No waste in nature, that's for sure. Okay, so here again you've got the idea of the detritus and then the decomposers, and there we go again, you get the plants to be able to grow back in again. So as time goes, that's the way it's going to work for you. Very interesting. No waste in nature at all. Okay, so we talked about energy and nutrient cycling as well, and these are things that are going to be important for us. The nutrient cycling is a loop. The energy flow goes in one direction. So here we have the sun helping for the producers. You can see how the ecosystem is going to be connected here. Closed loop. They give off heat. There's the decomposers. This is just a way of showing that it's a closed loop here, and that's cyclical. So they're all related to each other. Okay, energy is a little bit different. Energy only goes one way, right? So here's an energy chain, and in an energy chain, the arrows go the way the energy is flowing. and that's going to be true here. So we have, this is another term to be familiar with, first trophic level, that's the producers. Secondary consumer, or rather, secondary trophic level is the primary consumer. That can be confusing. I just mixed it up there a little bit. So the trophic level is as you go up, and the first stop is the producers, the second stop is the primary consumer, and then the secondary consumer and the tertiary consumer as you go up the food chain. Every step along the way here, this is a thermodynamics question, as the energy is going up the trophic levels, we lose the heat. And as I'll show in a diagram soon, and I'll mention it again now, we lose 90% of the energy as we go up each trophic level in energy. Okay, so this shows a food chain for you, but it's more connected than that, and that's why the biodiversity is more important. It's really more of a food web. So again, you can see these things. I used to think that these food webs, the arrows should go from the thing that's doing the eating to the thing that gets eaten. But that's not the way it works. It's counterintuitive to what I thought. But the way the arrow flows is the way the energy is going. So here you see a very interconnected food web, and that's why taking away pieces of it, we do that at our peril, I guess. It's going to change things. And maybe not for the better. All right, biomass, well, we talked about matter as anything that has mass, so it's like measurable. And biomass also changes as you go up the food web. The eagle, there's a lot less eagle than there are grass. If you measure the biomass of the grass, it's way more than the biomass of the eagles or the tertiary consumers. So there's going to be a decrease in energy and also in biomass as you go up the chain here. Ecological efficiency is kind of like the efficiencies of the industrial processes as well. You want to make, this is a way of talking about how much energy you lose. And the efficiency number is higher the more energy you get to maintain, the less energy you use. And of course, that's a pretty good goal for us for economic and energy concerns for human beings. But in general, and we're still kind of keeping our focus here to what would happen without human beings, this is what the pyramid looks like. So the idea again is that you are losing 10% every step along the way. So as you go up, you lose 10% of the you retain 10% and lose 90% of the energy. So here if you had 10,000 units worth of energy to start with, at the next level you only have 1,000 available. That's a 90% loss. Okay, so this pyramid shows that. And as I mentioned before, the same thing with biomass, the amount of matter at each step of the game. Okay, so just like we did with economics, we can talk about productivity here. And here, the idea of gross primary productivity is how much energy there is that you start with, and the net is how much that goes into usable energy. So some of these are able to move the energy a little bit better. And here are the idea of the net primary productivity for different ecosystems. So tropical rainforests and swamps, a lot more than the desert, as you can imagine. And estuaries, large amounts of biodiversity. So they have a good high net primary productivity. And those things are connected. Okay, so this is that again. And matter. Matter in an ecosystem is going to move from one form to another, but it's going to come in forms that we're going to now recognize here, and we have a little bit of a better understanding all the time about how these things work. Okay, so there are different types of things that we should be talking about, and these are 5 cycles that you should be very familiar with. And so when we talk about nutrient cycling and how that's an important thing, these are what we're talking about here. So these are the biogeochemical cycles, and you should try to get familiar with all of these. Okay, so the water cycle, the hydrological cycle is one to be talking about. So evaporation, that's when water just goes up into the air. Precipitation is when it comes back down again. And transpiration, as I mentioned before, is as water flows through plants. So that's how it gets cycled. Here is a nice diagram that your book has that gives you an idea of the hydrological cycle. And also here does tie in what humans are doing, the anthropogenic part of it. So this is something that you want to be very familiar with here, and you should be able to make as many connections as you possibly can. Right now, it probably looks pretty intuitive. Some of it does, and you should start to understand in as much detail as you can all of these different cycles. And this is the first one, the hydrological cycle. All right, carbon is a big deal. I've already mentioned photosynthesis and respiration, so that's one way that carbon is going to go through here, through the system here. And here is a way of talking about how carbon gets into the atmosphere and comes back down again. CO2, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is a big thing that we're talking about. And this shows how humans are doing it, and also how it would have naturally been done anyway. So in blue, they're showing you what nature does, and in red, they're showing you the effect that human beings have. An interesting one here to show. I think we think about burning fossil fuels as putting CO2 into the air. We're pretty familiar with that. And deforestation, maybe we don't think about that as much, but if there's less trees to take in CO2, then that's going to add to the CO2 in the atmosphere. The ocean and water also can hold carbon dioxide as well, and these places where you're storing a lot of carbon dioxide, plants store a lot of carbon dioxide because they've taken in the carbon dioxide. So that is what they call a carbon sink. A carbon sink is going to be a place where you're storing a lot of carbon. The ocean is a carbon sink because it holds a lot of carbon in it. So that's a key phrase there, the carbon sink. Okay. Nitrogen, very important for us as well. Nitrogen, well, when we're talking about nutrient cycling as far as grass being grown or plants being grown or producers, we need the nitrogen in there. That gives us the stuff that we need to grow crops and for any plants to grow, really. And that's why we get involved, again, the human pathways in red, with fertilizers. So this is another cycle here that we're really involved in a big way, and we have to be for the fertilizers. These things have effects in the atmospheres too when they go through their chemical reactions, and those are things that we're going to talk about in some detail later too. Here is a really good, I think, and a little bit more detail than your book gives, idea of how this really works with the nitrogen. So the plants here, you have to have bacteria that's going to fix the nitrogen, and the nitrogen has to be in place for the plants to be able to grow. So this is kind of the way that is going to work out. The decomposers break it down. You've got ammonium, so there's your nitrogen in the form of ammonium. Then that becomes by bacteria, so we have to have the bacteria there in the step called nitrification. That gives you your nitrites, still not ready there to be used for plants. They need it to be in the form of nitrates, so you need bacteria to do that step for you. Some of this will get released to the atmosphere, and some of this in the step called assimilation is brought into the plants. So there you go, and that's a good cycle for you to be pretty well familiar with. And the nitrogen cycle has other components to it as well, but this is the one in the soil that we really want to be concerned with. So take a little time and get that one in your memory. Or take some good notes, put it in your outline. Okay, phosphorus is the only cycle that does not have an airborne quantity to it. It takes a long time for these things to break down. This is a relatively slow setup here. Phosphates are in the rocks and in the core here, and so they're involved in these cycles, but there's no airborne component to it. We need the phosphates also for the plants to grow. So nitrates and phosphates are big ones that are going to be used in fertilizers, and that's a really good one to be aware of as well. Okay, and here's sulfur as well. So we need sulfur as well. So that's a mineral that, that's something that's going to be needed by animals as well, and we are putting a lot of sulfur into the atmosphere as well. And that becomes a little bit of a problem here for some of our processes. Through mining and burning coal, that's been a big issue for us, putting sulfur into the air, and it does come back as sulfuric acid. Acid rain, which also has effects, and we'll talk more about that later too. Okay, so how do the scientists go about doing this? This is the science that we've been talking about. One of the things is they got to go out there and get a little bit dirty too. So muddy boots biology, got to go and collect information. We're getting more and more to the point where we can do a lot of this stuff through our technology. So before, where you might have to walk through forest after forest, we can do some things from the air as well to figure out what's going on. And there's a lot more technology available to us than we had before. So our inventory of what's going on the planet, we're a lot more aware of it now anyway. Another thing, and we've mentioned before, is the idea of doing experiments. Well, we can do experiments, that's for sure, but again, there's limitations. If you do something in the lab, you're ruling out all the things that are going on in nature that you might have to take into account. And out in nature, it's hard to figure out exactly what the cause and effects are when there's so many different variables going on. Generally, what you want to do is what's called a controlled experiment. So the idea of a controlled experiment is that it's kind of like a before and after picture in a sense. Some of your samples, maybe you're looking at the effect that fertilizer would have on a plant. So maybe you're going to have a plant that has no fertilizer added to it. That would be the control. And then you would have one that has a certain quantity, and then maybe one with a different quantity. So this would be, but using the same plant, and that way that's the controlled environment. So you're going to have to decide what is going to stay the same and what's going to change. But that's the idea of a controlled experiment, is you have something that doesn't have the factors affecting it, so you can compare it to the ones that do. And in your controlled experiments that you design or are asked to design, you should have more than one example. You shouldn't have just one thing compared to another, like the fertilizer. Maybe you have one with no fertilizer, that would be your control. Then you have one that is, a 1% fertilizer, and then one that's 7%, and one that's 15%. Maybe you want to have a few different comparisons, I guess, is what it comes down to. So you wouldn't just have with fertilizer and without fertilizer. You'd have without fertilizer, with fertilizer, but a bunch of different examples of that. And that's a good controlled experiment. So all these things are used together, and like I said, this is constantly evolving. People say the scientists don't know what they're talking about. Well, that could be true, but also a lot of times it's what they knew at the moment, the best knowledge at the moment, and that's going to change as we take in more information. But all of these things together are how we study these ecosystems. Now, just like in financial markets, where you're going to want to make projections. If this is what's happening now, what do we think is going to be happening? Well, that's the same kind of thing here for environmental science. So we want to use simulations that are going to say, okay, if this is what's going on now, if we continue along this track, what's going to be happening in 10 years or 100 years? Remember, we're after sustainability, so we want to be thinking about these long-term questions. Okay, so the baseline data here is what we have when we start, and then we can take a look at how things are changing, and we have lots of cases like that to look at. Okay, well that's the end of my talk for Chapter 3. I hope this was helpful. If it raised any questions, please bring them to class with you, and I look forward to seeing you there.